Hello, everyone. So, for on Chapter 12, Social Movements, I wanted to provide some insight and some thoughts on thinking about social movements from the present, but also historically that are laid out in this chapter, and some of the issues that we think about, or some of the figures that come to mind when we consider social movements and those who take leadership positions. And we know historically, many have been male-centered. We have the image of the charismatic figure who is able to amass a large following, such as MLK, Cesar Chavez here, folks like Gandhi. And then you have some more contemporary figures here as Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. Then you have this image of the 1968 Black Power salute. Um, but what I want to point also is to the other individual not lifting his fist, and that's Peter Norman, who is Australia, who also paid a heavy price for standing there in solidarity with these two Black American athletes who took a stand in 1968. So he paid a price, a heavy, very heavy price, for taking part in this movement for equality. And this is, as I mentioned before, has been a constant thematic throughout our American history. Anytime any one individual or a group stand up for their rights, things happen to them. They are either vilified, they are targeted, they are repressed, jailed, or even killed, and not very popular in society at the time. So we can point to folks like Martin Luther King Jr. during his time period. He was revered by many, but yet hated and vilified and even condemned by the federal government themselves. And we know this just with the release of some JFK papers last week, where this is well detailed in those documents. But what we're see a shift now, when we're trying to understand contemporary social movements, we need to move away from this idea of the iconic individual leader, right? Because in this day and age, there are many leaders. And in this image here, you have Alicia Garza, who's one of the co-founders of the initial Black Lives Matter movement. And as she's quoted here, she says, "We have lots of leaders, but if you're looking for that archetype of the MLK, the Cesar Chavez, or the Gandhi, you're finding leaders, but not where you may be looking for them. If you're only looking for the straight black man who's a preacher, you're not going to find it." And that is exactly so, because leadership in social movements is not confined to the individual. Leadership is open to those who want to partake in social movements and actually who are partaking in the work on the ground. So as we move through, there's a couple videos that I've embedded it throughout this PowerPoint presentation. I want you to take a look to think about how some of these social movements are coalesced. This one here, you'll be seeing Joel Olson, the late Joel Olson, on the concept of solidarity and what it means to build a successful social movement when he's addressing a group of students during the Occupy movement. So notions of citizenship, and this image here entails what social movements are. But if we go back to this concept of democratic citizenship, what does that entail? How does one participate in democratic citizenship? And these ideas are laid out by James Kettner here. So social movements are these sustained challenges to those in power put forth by individuals acting with others, and those traditionally who have been excluded from the political processes. Right? So as we're detailing what social movements are, what are the origins of social movements, how do we measure the successes of movements, and what strategies one may enact to begin a social movement or to encourage more participation in the social movement. And one key concept is an act is civil disobedience. So that is intentionally breaking a law and accepting the consequences as a way to publicize the unjustness of the law. And in this image, you have a very young MLK who was being arrested for conducting social movements. So many social movements throughout our history women's rights, the suffrage movement in the early 19th, 20th centuries, the civil rights movements in the 1960s, and I say movements because there were multiple, from nonviolent to militant, violent to groups like the other underground, enacting forms of violence in order to change the social, political, and economic relations of the nation, from the Chicano movements in the 60s and 70s, headquartered in the Southwest, to the anti-war movement during the Vietnam period, and that continues today, in the opposition to the current conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, and various contemporary social movements taking place from students on campus to the streets, to marriage equality, and as I mentioned, the Occupy movement, and the immigrant rights movement in 2006, which was seen as the largest mass mobilization in the history of the United States, where you have millions of immigrants and their accomplices really mobilizing in over 125 cities on a given day. And to the Arab Spring, the Chilean winter, and what we have in Syria, what we see that led to civil war, the uprising in 2011, and undocumented students, and movements to abolish the prison industrial complex today, and the merging of the prison system also. And now this type of resistance is taking shape under Trump. So as we have read this, I just want you to consider how all these movements, the evolution of all these movements, what marks a success, taking from your textbook, and as you're responding in your discussion post, to how do you have selected to analyze a particular social movement, and how do we mark it as either successful or not. So that is it for now. I'll be updating us on our research paper, which will be coming up due very shortly. But for now, enjoy this chapter, and I would look forward to reading your discussion post.